The furnace breathed like a sleeping animal. Elias Carr crouched in the basement of the condemned house, his headlamp cutting through decades of accumulated soot. The beam revealed something that shouldn't have been there. Fresh scratches in the metal, recent burn marks that told a story nobody wanted to hear. He pulled off his work gloves and touched the furnace door. Still warm. Someone had been using this place. Elias stood slowly, his joints protesting after 30 years of crawling through narrow spaces. At 52, he moved like a man who'd seen too much, said too little, and learned that silence was the sharpest tool in any kit. The beam of his headlamp swept across the basement walls, revealing more signs of recent activity. Food wrappers, empty beer bottles, a sleeping bag in the corner that still smelled of cigarettes and desperation. Above him, floorboards creaked. Footsteps, deliberate and careful. Elias switched off his headlamp and waited. The footsteps moved toward the basement door. A voice called out, muffled but clear enough. "Anyone down there?" The voice belonged to Deputy Martinez, someone Elias recognized from his occasional encounters with local law enforcement. Not someone looking for trouble, just doing his job. Elias switched his headlamp back on and called up. "Just finishing the inspection, Deputy. Coming up now." Elias climbed the wooden stairs, each step announcing his presence. Deputy Martinez waited at the top, hand resting casually on his belt, but not on his weapon. Professional caution, nothing more. "Mr. Carr, right?" Martinez asked. "You're the furnace guy?" "That's right." Elias brushed soot from his coveralls. "A house has been abandoned for 2 years, but someone's been using the furnace. Recent use, probably within the last week." Martinez nodded and made a note in his small pad. "We've had reports of squatters in some of these condemned places. Anything else unusual?" Elias considered telling him about the scratches, the specific pattern that suggested someone had been trying to dismantle parts of the furnace. Instead, he shook his head. "Just the recent use. You might want to check it regular like." "Will do. Thanks for calling it in." Martinez left through the front door and Elias heard his patrol car drive away. Alone again, Elias walked back to the basement. He'd lied to the deputy, but not without reason. The scratches on the furnace weren't random. They were precise, methodical, made by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone trying to remove the serial numbers. Elias had seen this before, back when he wore a different uniform in a different state. Before he'd come to this small Appalachian town looking for something resembling peace. Before he'd met Mara and tried to convince himself that a quiet life was what he needed. He gathered his tools and headed home, but the image of those scratches stayed with him. In his truck, driving the winding mountain roads, Elias found himself thinking about patterns. How people repeated their mistakes. How they thought geography could erase their past. The house he shared with Mara and their 15-year-old daughter, Lottie, sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by trees that blocked most of the afternoon sun. Mara's car was already there, which meant she'd gotten off work early again, the 3rd time this month. Inside, Lottie was at the kitchen table with homework spread around her like battle plans. She looked up when Elias entered, offering him the kind of smile that was becoming increasingly rare. "Hey, Dad, how was work?" "Fine. Where's your mother?" "Upstairs. She said she had a headache." Elias washed his hands at the kitchen sink, scrubbing away the day's accumulation of soot and ash. Through the window above the sink, he could see his work shed, where he kept his tools, and in a locked cabinet most people wouldn't notice, other things from his previous life. "Lottie, you finish your homework. I'm going to check on your mother." Lottie nodded and returned to her books. Elias climbed the stairs, noting how the 3rd step from the top still creaked, despite his efforts to fix it. Some sounds became part of a house's vocabulary, impossible to silence. The bedroom door was closed. Elias knocked softly. "Mara, you okay?" "Come in." Mara was lying on the bed, still in her work clothes. She managed facilities for elderly care homes, a job that required her to visit multiple locations throughout the day. It was demanding work, she often said, dealing with families and medical staff and the constant paperwork that came with caring for people at the end of their lives. "Rough day?" Elias asked. "The usual." "Mrs. Patterson's family is threatening to sue again. They think we're not giving her enough attention, but they visit maybe once a month." Mara rubbed her temples. "I might be late tomorrow. We're training a new guy, and I need to show him the ropes." "New guy?" "Jensen Crow. He grew up around here somewhere, moved back from the city. Seems competent enough." Elias nodded. "I'll pick up Lottie from school then." "Thanks. You're good that way." The conversation felt rehearsed, like they were reading from a script they'd both memorized, but neither particularly enjoyed. Elias left Mara to rest and went downstairs to help Lottie with her homework. Later that evening, after dinner, and after Lottie had gone to her room, Elias and Mara sat in the living room, with the television providing background noise neither was really watching. Mara scrolled through her phone while Elias read a book about furnace maintenance that he'd already read twice. Elias? Yeah. Do you ever think about leaving here, starting over somewhere else? The question surprised him. Why would you ask that? I don't know. Sometimes I feel like we're stuck, like we're just going through the motions. Elias looked at his wife. After 12 years of marriage, he could usually read her expressions, understand the subtext of her words. Tonight, she seemed distant, as if part of her was already somewhere else. If you want to leave, we can talk about it, Elias said. But Lottie's settled here, her friends, school. I know, it's probably just a phase. Forget I mentioned it. But Elias didn't forget. Over the next few days, he found himself paying closer attention to the small details of their life. Mara's schedule, her mood, the way she handled her phone like it contained secrets. 3 days later, while inspecting a commercial furnace at the county hospital, Elias ran into Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd been Lottie's pediatrician since they'd moved to town. Elias, good to see you. How's the family? Fine. Mara's busy with work. New employee to train. At the care facilities? I might know him. We work with several of those places. Jensen Crow. Dr. Chen's expression shifted slightly. I remember Jensen. We went to high school together. He left town under somewhat complicated circumstances. Complicated how? Dr. Chen glanced around, making sure their conversation remained private. There were some accusations, nothing proven, but the kind of thing that makes people uncomfortable. He worked at a care facility before, up in Pennsylvania. There were questions about missing medications, but he left before any formal investigation. And now he's back. Apparently. I'm sure Mara's keeping an eye on things. She's always been thorough about vetting her staff. Elias finished his work at the hospital and drove home, but Dr. Chen's words stayed with him. That evening, he called his former partner from his days as a police detective. Ray, it's Elias. I need you to run a background check on someone. Ray Hutchins had worked with Elias for 8 years before Elias left law enforcement. They'd stayed in touch, though their conversations were infrequent. Sure thing. What's the name? Jensen Crow, probably mid-30s, worked at care facilities in Pennsylvania before moving back here to West Virginia. This official business? Personal? Guys working with Mara? Got it. I'll call you back in a day or two. Ray called back the next evening while Elias was in his shed, organizing tools. Your boy Jensen has an interesting history, Ray said. No convictions, but he's left several jobs under questionable circumstances. Missing medications, unexplained cash shortages, and at least 2 allegations of inappropriate relationships with coworkers. Inappropriate how? Sexual maltreatment complaints that were settled out of court. Guy has a pattern of targeting women in positions of authority, getting them compromised, then using that leverage for his own benefit. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. Anything else? He's got gambling debts, significant ones, the kind that make people desperate. After Ray hung up, Elias sat in his shed surrounded by the tools of his trade. Furnace repair required precision, patience, and an understanding of how systems worked. When something was broken, you had to find the source of the problem, not just treat the symptoms. That weekend, Mara announced she needed to work Saturday to help Jensen get caught up on his training. She left early and returned late, claiming they'd had to deal with an emergency at one of the facilities. What kind of emergency? Elias asked. One of the residents had a fall. We had to coordinate with the family, the doctors, document everything properly. Jensen was helpful, but he's still learning our procedures. Lottie looked up from her phone. Mom, you smell like cigarettes. Mara paused. One of the nurses was smoking outside. It's hard to avoid. But Elias knew Mara had never tolerated cigarette smoke. She was nearly allergic to it, would complain bitterly if someone smoked near her car or in a restaurant. The excuse didn't fit. Monday morning, Elias drove to the first care facility on Mara's route. He parked across the street and waited. Mara's car arrived at 8:30, exactly when she'd said it would. But Jensen's truck was already there, parked in the back where it wasn't visible from the main road. Elias waited 3 hours. Neither Mara nor Jensen emerged from the building. When he called the facility's main number and asked to speak with Mara Carr, the receptionist told him Mrs. Carr wasn't scheduled to be there that day. That evening, Elias confronted Mara directly. "Where were you today?" "At the Riverside facility." "Why?" "I called there. They said you weren't scheduled." Mara's face flushed. "There was a mix-up with the schedule. Jensen and I went to help out at the Miller Creek location instead." "And you didn't think to mention that?" "It was a last-minute change. I don't report every detail of my workday to you, Elias." Lottie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Are you guys fighting?" "We're just talking," Mara said, "about work schedules." But Lottie's expression suggested she heard more than her parents intended. At 15, she was old enough to recognize tension, even when the adults tried to hide it. That night, Elias lay awake listening to Mara's breathing. She fell asleep quickly, but her sleep was restless, punctuated by small movements and half-formed words. Around 2 a.m., her phone buzzed with a text message. Mara reached for the phone immediately, fully awake. "Work emergency," she whispered, thinking Elias was still asleep. Elias watched through barely opened eyes as Mara read the message, typed a response, then deleted both the incoming message and her reply. When she was satisfied, the phone showed no evidence of the exchange. She placed it back on the nightstand and lay down again. The next morning, while Mara was in the shower, Elias examined her phone. The messaging app showed no recent activity, but Elias noticed something else. The phone's data usage for the past month was 3 times higher than usual. Someone was using apps that required significant bandwidth, apps that probably weren't related to elderly care administration. Elias began his own investigation. Over the next week, he followed Mara's movements whenever possible. The pattern became clear. 3 days a week, Mara's car would arrive at various care facilities at the expected times. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, she would park at the Miller Creek facility, then leave her car there and drive away in Jensen's truck. They would spend 4 to 5 hours at locations that had nothing to do with elderly care, a motel outside town, a cabin rental near the lake, places where people went when they didn't want to be seen. Elias could have confronted Mara immediately, but his police training had taught him the value of thorough documentation. Instead, he began building a case. Photos of Mara getting into Jensen's truck. Receipts from the motel that matched the dates and times of her supposed work emergencies. Phone records that showed calls and texts to a number registered under Jensen's name. The evidence was methodical and irrefutable. But as Elias compiled it, he realized that catching Mara in an affair was only the beginning. The real question was what he planned to do about it. Late one evening, alone in his shed, Elias opened the locked cabinet that contained his service weapon, his old badge, and several items that most people would consider concerning. Handcuffs, a taser, surveillance equipment, and a small notebook containing names and addresses of people who owed favors to a former police detective. Elias had left law enforcement, but he'd never stopped being a cop. The skills, the mindset, the network of contacts, all of it remained, waiting for the right moment to be useful again. He made his first call to Ray. "I need another favor." "What kind?" "The quiet kind." Ray was silent for a moment. "How quiet?" "The kind where someone disappears from their current life but doesn't necessarily stop existing." "That's expensive, Elias, and dangerous. I'm not asking you to do anything, I just need some names. People who provide certain services." "I'll think about it." The next day, Mara announced another weekend work emergency. This time, Elias was ready. He'd installed a GPS tracker on her car and planted a small recording device in her purse. Technology had advanced significantly since his police days, and the equipment was nearly undetectable. Saturday morning, Mara kissed him goodbye and told him she'd be back by evening. Elias waited 30 minutes, then followed the GPS signal to the lake cabin. He parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, moving through the woods with the careful silence he'd learned during his early years in law enforcement. The cabin had large windows facing the lake, and Mara and Jensen made no effort to close the curtains. Elias positioned himself behind a fallen tree with a clear view of the interior and activated the camera he'd brought. What he saw and recorded over the next 2 hours was more than infidelity. Mara and Jensen were planning something beyond their affair. They spoke about Elias with contempt, about Lottie as an obstacle, about the house and Elias's savings as assets to be divided. "He's so stupid," Mara said, lying without clothes next to Jensen on the cabin's bed. "He thinks I actually love him. He thinks this little mountain life is enough for someone like me." Jensen laughed. "What are you going to do about the kid?" "Lottie worships me. She'll choose me over him when the time comes." especially after I tell her about his past. His past? He was a cop, Jensen, but not the good kind. He left Pennsylvania under some very dark circumstances. I found out about it years ago, but never said anything. When I'm ready to file for divorce, that information will be very useful. Elias felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart. That had been damaged beyond repair years ago. Something deeper. The last pretense that people could be trusted, that loyalty meant something, that love was more than a convenient fiction. He continued recording. Mara and Jensen discussed timeline, legal strategy, and how to maximize Mara's financial settlement. They talked about Elias like he was already dead, just a problem to be solved and disposed of. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation became more specific. Jensen revealed that he'd been documenting Elias's daily routines, his work schedule, even the contents of his shed. He's got some interesting stuff out there, Jensen said. Police equipment, weapons. If someone were to call in an anonymous tip about a potentially dangerous individual stockpiling illegal materials, that's perfect, Mara said, especially combined with his history. No judge would give him custody after that. Elias had heard enough. He packed up his equipment and returned to his truck, but he didn't go home. Instead, he drove to a payphone outside a gas station and made a call to one of the names Ray had provided. "I need to meet," Elias said when the call was answered. "When?" "Tonight." The meeting took place at a truck stop 40 miles away. The man who greeted Elias looked like a retired accountant, but Elias knew his actual profession involved making problems disappear permanently. "Ray said you might need some work done," the man said. "Maybe. Depends on the scope of services available. I offer consultation on a variety of issues: personal security, competitive intelligence, relationship mediation." Elias understood the euphemisms. What about more permanent solutions? Those are available, but they're expensive and require significant planning. How expensive? For the kind of problem Ray described, $50,000, half upfront, half on completion. Elias had the money. His police pension, combined with 12 years of steady work and minimal expenses, had left him with substantial savings. The question wasn't whether he could afford it, but whether he was ready to cross that line. "I need to think about it." "Don't think too long. Problems like yours tend to get worse with time." Elias drove home through the mountain darkness, past the places where he'd built what he thought was a life. The house came into view, warm and welcoming in the porch light Mara always left on for him. She was waiting in the kitchen when he entered, wearing the same clothes she'd had on at the cabin, but having showered and changed her makeup. "How was work?" Elias asked. "Exhausting. Mrs. Patterson's son showed up drunk and started threatening the staff. Jensen and I had to call security and deal with the whole mess." The lie came so easily, delivered with perfect sincerity and appropriate weariness. Elias almost admired the performance. "That sounds difficult." It was. "I'm going to bed early. We have to be back there first thing in the morning to file reports." Mara kissed his cheek, the same gesture she'd made thousands of times over 12 years of marriage. Elias felt nothing. After Mara went upstairs, Elias sat in his kitchen and made a decision, but not the one the man at the truck stop was expecting. Over the next 2 weeks, Elias began implementing a different kind of plan. Instead of eliminating Jensen, he would eliminate Jensen's life. His job, his reputation, his future prospects, his ability to function in civilized society. Elias started with Jensen's gambling debts. A few calls to his police contacts revealed the names of Jensen's creditors, dangerous people who were already motivated to cause Jensen significant problems. An anonymous tip about Jensen's location and new source of income would accelerate their collection efforts. Next, Elias contacted the facilities where Jensen had previously worked. He provided detailed information about Jensen's current location and employment, along with suggestions that those facilities might want to alert current employers about unresolved issues. Within a week, Jensen began experiencing pressure from multiple directions. His creditors found him. His former employers started making calls. The care facilities where he worked with Mara began asking uncomfortable questions about his background. But Elias's most effective attack was psychological. He began stalking Jensen, not to damage him, but to make him aware that he was being watched. Jensen would find Elias's truck parked outside his apartment at unusual hours. He would see Elias at the grocery store, the gas station, the diner where Jensen ate lunch. Jensen confronted Mara about it. "Your husband is following me," Jensen told her during one of their recorded conversations. "That's impossible. Elias barely leaves the house except for work. I'm telling you, he knows something. He's everywhere I go. You're being paranoid. But Jensen wasn't paranoid. He was being hunted by someone who understood how to apply pressure without breaking any laws. Elias never threatened Jensen directly, never made contact, never did anything that could be reported to police. He simply existed in Jensen's peripheral vision, a constant reminder that someone was watching. The pressure worked. Jensen's performance at work deteriorated. He became distracted, suspicious, prone to angry outbursts that made his coworkers uncomfortable. When the complaints about his background finally reached his supervisors, Jensen was already on thin ice. He was fired on a Thursday afternoon. Mara was devastated, though she tried to hide it from Elias. Her affair partner was suddenly unemployed, under investigation by his former employers, and being maltreated by debt collectors. The romantic fantasy of running away together became significantly less appealing when Jensen could barely afford his rent. But Elias wasn't finished. Jensen's unemployment was just the first phase. That weekend, Jensen's apartment was burglarized. Nothing of significant value was taken, but the intruders had clearly searched through everything. Personal documents, financial records, correspondence, all of it disturbed and examined. Jensen filed a police report, but his credibility was already compromised by his employment issues and financial problems. The burglary was followed by other incidents. Jensen's truck developed mysterious mechanical problems. His credit cards were canceled due to suspicious activity. His utilities were shut off due to alleged non-payment, despite his insistence that all bills were current. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained as coincidence or bureaucratic error. Together, they formed a pattern of systematic maltreatment that left Jensen increasingly isolated and desperate. Mara tried to support him, but the strain was obvious. Their romantic getaways were replaced by tense conversations about money and paranoia. Jensen accused Mara of not doing enough to help him, while Mara accused Jensen of bringing his problems into their relationship. The final blow came when Jensen discovered that someone had been distributing information about his gambling debts and employment history throughout the small community where he'd grown up. Former friends and family members began avoiding him. His elderly mother received anonymous calls describing her son's alleged criminal activities. Jensen snapped. He confronted Elias directly, cornering him in the parking lot of the hardware store where Elias bought supplies for his work. "I know you're doing this," Jensen said, getting close enough that Elias could smell booze on his breath. "Doing what?" Elias asked calmly. "Don't play stupid." The phone calls turning everyone against me. "I think you're confused. My life was fine until you showed up everywhere. Now, everything's falling apart." Elias looked at Jensen with the expression he'd once reserved for criminals who were too stupid to realize they'd been caught. "Your life was falling apart before I knew you existed," Elias said. "I just helped speed up the process." Jensen swung at him. The punch was clumsy, telegraphed by someone who'd been drinking and wasn't thinking clearly. Elias dodged easily and responded with a quick jab to Jensen's solar plexus, followed by a knee to his midsection as he doubled over. Jensen collapsed to the asphalt, gasping for breath. Elias knelt beside him. "I was a police detective for 15 years, Elias said quietly. "I know how to destroy someone's life without breaking any laws. I also know how to break laws without getting caught. Which approach I take depends entirely on how much you annoy me." Elias stood and walked away, leaving Jensen on the ground in the hardware store parking lot. That evening, Jensen left town. His apartment was abandoned with most of his belongings still inside. His truck was found at the bus station, keys on the dashboard. He simply disappeared, leaving behind only debts and bad memories. Mara was frantic. She called Jensen's phone repeatedly, left desperate voicemails, even drove to his apartment and pounded on the door until neighbors threatened to call police. "I can't reach Jensen," she told Elias, no longer bothering to hide her concern. "Maybe he found work somewhere else," Elias suggested. "He would have told me." "Would he?" Mara stared at Elias, and for the first time in their marriage, she seemed to really see him. Not the quiet furnace repairman she'd married, but the man who'd existed before. The cop. The hunter. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I fixed a problem." Mara's face went pale. "Elias, if you hurt him, I didn't hurt anyone. But problems have a way of solving themselves if you know how to apply the right pressure." That night, Mara tried to search Elias's shed. She was clumsy about it, clearly not experienced in covert activities. Elias watched from the house as she used her phone's flashlight to examine his tools, his workbench, the locked cabinet that contained his police equipment. She found the cabinet, but it required a key she didn't have. She also found the GPS tracker he'd used to follow her. carelessly left on his workbench where she'd be sure to see it. Mara returned to the house, pale and shaking. "We need to talk," she said. "About what?" "About what you know. About what you've done." Elias looked at his wife, this woman he'd trusted with 12 years of his life, and felt nothing but cold calculation. "I know about the affair," he said. "I know about your plans to divorce me and take everything I've worked for. I know about the lies you've been telling Lottie about me." Mara's composure cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Elias pulled out his phone and played a recording of Mara and Jensen at the lake cabin, discussing their plans to destroy his reputation and take custody of Lottie. "He's so stupid," Mara's voice came from the phone speaker. "He thinks I actually love him." The recording continued for several minutes, capturing Mara's contempt and Jensen's suggestions for framing Elias as an unfit parent. When it finished, Mara was crying. "Elias, I can explain." "No need. I understand perfectly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Jensen and we just connected, and things got complicated." "You planned to destroy my life," Elias said. "You planned to take my daughter. You planned to steal everything I've built and leave me with nothing." I was confused. "I made mistakes. You made choices. Now you live with the consequences." Elias walked to his shed and returned with a manila folder. Inside were copies of all the evidence he'd gathered. Photos, recordings, financial documents showing Mara's fraudulent expense reports and Jensen's gambling debts. "I'm filing for divorce," Elias said. "Custody of Lottie, division of assets, everything. This evidence shows infidelity, fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury." Mara looked through the folder, her face growing paler with each page. "You can't do this. Lottie needs her mother. Lottie needs a parent who tells the truth. I'll fight you. I'll tell them about your past, about what you really are." Elias smiled, and Mara flinched at the expression. "Please do. I'd love to have that conversation in court, especially the part where you explain how you discovered information about my police service while planning to commit fraud." The divorce proceedings began the following week. Elias hired the best attorney in the region, a woman who specialized in cases involving law enforcement personnel. Mara hired a local lawyer who was clearly out of his depth. The evidence Elias presented was overwhelming. The recordings of Mara planning to destroy his reputation, financial records showing her misuse of company resources to fund her affair, documentation of her lies to their daughter, and her conspiracy with Jensen to frame Elias for crimes he hadn't committed. Mara's lawyer tried to argue that the evidence was obtained illegally, but surveillance of a spouse suspected of infidelity was legal in their state. He tried to argue that Mara was the sufferer of an abusive husband, but Elias's police record showed no history of domestic violence, while the recordings clearly showed Mara as the aggressor. The custody hearing was particularly brutal. Lottie, now 16, testified about her parents' marriage and the changes she'd witnessed over the past few months. "My mom started lying," Lottie said from the witness stand. "She said she was working, but she wasn't. She said she loved Dad, but I heard her on the phone saying terrible things about him." Mara's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed the testimony. "Did your father ever mistreat you or your mother?" the judge asked. "No," Lottie said firmly. "Dad never hurt anyone. He just got quiet after Mom started acting different." The hearing lasted 3 days. When it was over, Elias had been awarded full custody of Lottie, the house, and the majority of their shared assets. Mara was ordered to pay child support and given limited visitation rights. But Elias wasn't finished. Mara's employer had been provided with copies of her fraudulent expense reports and documentation of her unprofessional conduct with Jensen. She was fired and faced potential criminal charges for embezzlement. Her friend Carlene, who had helped cover for the affair, found herself under investigation by the state board that licensed her own job in healthcare administration. Anonymous tips had revealed a pattern of ethical violations and professional misconduct. Within 6 months, Mara had lost her marriage, her daughter, her house, her job, and most of her friends. She was forced to move to a small apartment across town, working part-time jobs to pay her legal bills and child support. The final confrontation came on a cold December evening. Mara appeared at Elias's door, having walked through the snow because her car had been repossessed. "Please," she said. "I know I hurt you, but I'm begging you. Call off whatever you're doing to me." Elias looked at the woman who had once been his wife. She was thinner now, worn down by months of constant pressure. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes cheap and ill-fitting. "I'm not doing anything to you," Elias said. "I'm just letting you experience the natural consequences of your choices." "My choices?" You destroyed Jensen's life. You've turned everyone against me. You've taken everything. I defended my family. I protected my daughter from people who wanted to damage her for their own benefit. She was my daughter too. No, Elias said. She was someone you were willing to hurt to get what you wanted. Parents don't do that. Mara began crying, the kind of desperate sobs that came from someone who had finally realized the full extent of their situation. I loved you, she said. I know you don't believe that now, but I did love you once. Maybe you did, but love isn't enough when someone decides to become your enemy. What about forgiveness? What about mercy? Elias was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. In his shed, locked in a cabinet, he still had the phone number of the man who could have made all of Mara's problems permanent. He'd chosen a different path, one that left her alive, but destroyed. I gave you mercy, he said finally. You're still breathing. Mara left that night and never returned. Elias heard from mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another state, was working under a different name, trying to start over with nothing. Spring came early that year. Elias and Lottie settled into their new routine. Just the two of them in the house that felt larger now, but somehow more comfortable. Lottie was doing well in school, had made new friends, seemed untroubled by her mother's absence. Dad? She said one evening while they were having dinner. Yeah? I know what really happened. With Mom and Jensen and everything. Elias looked at his daughter, this young woman who was smarter and stronger than either of her parents had been at her age. What do you think happened? I think she made some really bad choices and you made sure she couldn't hurt us anymore. Does that bother you? Lottie considered the question carefully. No. I wish she'd been better, but I'm glad you protected us. That night, Elias sat in his shed cleaning his tools and thinking about the choices people made. The furnace in their house hummed quietly, providing steady heat through the cold mountain air. It was a good system, properly maintained, built to last. Outside, the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from other houses scattered through the valley. Neighbors heating their homes, families gathered around dinner tables, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Elias had built something like that once. A quiet life, a simple life, the kind of life that seemed possible when you believed that people were fundamentally good, that trust was valuable, that love meant something. Now he knew better. Now he understood that some people were threats that had to be managed, problems that had to be solved. He'd learned to use the skills he'd hoped to leave behind, to become again the person he'd been before he tried to be someone softer. The wind died down and the night became very quiet. In the distance, Elias could hear the sound of a truck engine, someone driving home late from work, or traveling to somewhere they thought would be better than where they'd been. People were always moving, always seeking something different, always believing that geography could change who they were inside. Elias had learned that was mostly an illusion. People carried themselves wherever they went, along with their weaknesses and their capacity for betrayal. But they also carried their capacity for justice, for protecting what mattered, for ensuring that actions had consequences. Elias locked his tools away and walked back to the house. Lottie was in her room, probably on the phone with friends or working on homework. The television was still on in the living room, showing some late-night movie neither of them had been watching. He turned off the lights and checked the locks, the same routine he'd followed for years. But now it felt different, more purposeful. He wasn't just securing a house, he was protecting a life he'd fought to preserve. In the morning, there would be furnaces to inspect, systems to repair, the familiar work of maintaining the infrastructure that kept people warm and safe. It was good work, honest work, the kind of work that served a clear purpose. But Elias would also continue the other work, the quieter work of watching and listening and remembering, because hunters always returned in one form or another, and someone had to be ready for them. The house settled into nighttime silence. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the mountain in clean, white silence. Inside, Elias Carr sat in his chair and waited for whatever came next, knowing that he was ready for it. 3 months later, Carlene Whitaker's house burned down. The fire started at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when the volunteer fire department was undermanned and the nearest truck was 20 minutes away. By the time help arrived, the house was fully engulfed, the flames visible from miles away against the black mountain sky. Carlene escaped with her life, but nothing else. Her insurance claim was denied due to what investigators called Suspicious circumstances. Witnesses reported seeing someone near the house shortly before the fire started, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. Carlene filed a police report claiming arson, but the investigation stalled when detectives discovered her connection to Mara's affair and the subsequent divorce proceedings. Her credibility was further damaged when financial records revealed that she'd been stealing from her employer, using her position to redirect payments for services that were never provided. She lost her job, her house, and her reputation within a matter of weeks. The stress triggered health problems that required expensive medical treatment she couldn't afford. She moved in with a sister in another state, broken and bitter, warning anyone who would listen about Elias Carr. But no one listened. Elias had been careful to establish his whereabouts during the time of the fire. He'd been on a service call 40 miles away, repairing a commercial furnace system for a client who remembered him clearly. Security cameras confirmed his presence. Timestamps and digital records provided an unbreakable alibi. The fire was officially classified as cause undetermined, a bureaucratic phrase that meant everyone suspected arson, but no one could prove it. Elias attended the weekly town council meetings where residents discussed community issues. He volunteered for the annual fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, contributing both money and labor to help them purchase new equipment. He was seen as a concerned citizen, someone who cared about public safety and community welfare. At the fundraiser, Deputy Martinez approached him. "Terrible thing about the Whitaker house," Martinez said. "Tragic," Elias agreed. "House fires are always devastating. Funny thing, though, that's the third house fire we've had this year, and all three belong to people who've had some kind of conflict recently." Elias raised an eyebrow. "What kind of conflict?" "Legal troubles, divorce proceedings, employment issues. Makes you wonder if someone's taking advantage of people when they're vulnerable. Or maybe stress makes people careless with cigarettes and space heaters," Elias suggested. Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "Could be. Still, I keep an eye on patterns. Part of the job? Good policy. People should be careful, especially when they've made enemies." After Martinez walked away, Elias continued working the fundraiser booth, selling raffle tickets and making small talk with neighbors. He was visible, engaged, clearly invested in the community's well-being. But that night, alone in his shed, Elias reviewed the list he kept in a small notebook. Names of people who had aided Mara's betrayal, who had knowledge they could use against him, who represented potential threats to the life he'd built with Lottie. Carlene's name had been crossed out. 2 other names remained. Dr. Patricia Vance had been Mara's gynecologist, the doctor who had provided false medical documentation to support Mara's claims of emotional distress during the divorce proceedings. She'd written reports describing injuries that didn't exist, symptoms that were fabricated, psychological trauma that was entirely fictional. The medical board was still investigating Dr. Vance's practices based on anonymous complaints that included detailed evidence of her fraudulent reports. Her medical license was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Several former patients had filed malpractice suits, encouraged by lawyers who'd been provided with compelling evidence of professional misconduct. Dr. Vance's reputation was destroyed, her practice closed, her personal life in ruins. She'd attempted self-destruction 6 weeks after her license suspension, an overdose of prescription medications that left her hospitalized for 2 weeks and under psychiatric observation. She would recover eventually, but she would never practice medicine again. The settlement costs from her malpractice suits would consume her savings, her house, her retirement funds. She would spend the rest of her life working minimum wage jobs, struggling to survive in the aftermath of her professional destruction. Elias considered that sufficient punishment for her crimes. The final name on his list was Thomas Brennan, Mara's divorce attorney. Brennan had known about Mara's fraudulent evidence, had helped her fabricate claims against Elias, had participated in the conspiracy to destroy an innocent man's reputation for financial gain. Brennan's law practice specialized in divorce cases where he encouraged clients to make false accusations of misuse, financial misconduct, and psychological manipulation. He'd built a profitable business destroying families and creating fictional sufferers for profit. The State Bar Association received a comprehensive file documenting Brennan's unethical practices. Financial records showing his pattern of overcharging clients, fabricating billable hours, and colluding with corrupt medical professionals to create false evidence. Audio recordings of Brennan coaching clients to lie under oath, instructing them to exaggerate or invent claims of domestic violence. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Brennan was disbarred within 3 months, his law practice dissolved, his professional reputation destroyed. He faced potential criminal charges for fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. But Elias wasn't satisfied with professional consequences. Brennan had tried to destroy Elias's relationship with his daughter, had encouraged Mara to make false accusations that could have resulted in criminal charges and imprisonment. That required a more personal response. Brennan lived alone in a large house outside town, the kind of isolated property that afforded privacy for activities that weren't meant to be observed. He had expensive habits: gambling, drinking, relationships with women who were significantly younger and more desperate than they appeared. Elias began watching Brennan's routines, documenting his movements, identifying vulnerabilities. Brennan was careless about security, often leaving doors unlocked, windows open, personal information visible to anyone who knew how to look. More importantly, Brennan had secrets that would destroy him if they became public. Financial irregularities that went beyond simple ethical violations. Relationships with clients that crossed legal and professional boundaries. Evidence of tax evasion, money laundering, and connections to organized crime figures who provided certain services in exchange for legal protection. Elias could have turned this information over to law enforcement, but that would have resulted in investigations, trials, appeals, and the possibility that Brennan might escape serious consequences through plea bargaining or prosecutorial incompetence. Instead, Elias chose a more direct approach. On a cold February night, Elias visited Brennan's house. The attorney was drunk, celebrating what he thought was a successful conclusion to his disbarment appeal. He'd convinced himself that he would be reinstated, that his legal troubles were temporary setbacks rather than permanent consequences. Elias entered through the back door, which Brennan had left unlocked in his intoxicated carelessness. He found Brennan passed out in his study, surrounded by empty bottles and legal documents related to his appeal. Elias sat in a chair opposite Brennan and waited. After an hour, Brennan woke up to find a stranger in his house, someone who looked familiar but took several moments to place. "Elias Carr," Brennan said finally. "What are you doing in my house?" "We need to have a conversation." Brennan reached for his phone, but Elias showed him a tool, held casually but with obvious competence. "Please don't do that," Elias said. "We're going to talk, and then I'm going to leave. How that conversation goes depends entirely on your level of cooperation." Brennan was sober now, alert and frightened. "If this is about the divorce case, that's over. The court made its decision. This is about the lies you helped my wife tell, the false accusations you encouraged her to make, the evidence you helped her fabricate. That's just legal strategy. Zealous representation of my client's interests." Elias smiled the same cold smile that had frightened Jensen months earlier. "Is that what you call it when you coach someone to commit perjury? When you conspire to frame an innocent person for crimes they didn't commit? You can't prove any of that." Elias set a digital recorder on the table between them and pressed play. Brennan's voice filled the room, clearly recorded during his meetings with Mara, instructing her to lie about Elias's behavior, helping her fabricate evidence of misuse that never occurred. "I can prove all of it," Elias said. "The question is whether I turn this evidence over to the FBI or handle the matter privately." Brennan's face went pale. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand the consequences of your actions. You tried to destroy my family. You tried to separate me from my daughter based on lies you knew were false. You participated in a conspiracy that could have resulted in my imprisonment. Look, I was just doing my job. Your job was to represent your client's legitimate interests, not to help her commit felonies." Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were photographs, financial documents, and other evidence of Brennan's criminal activities. "This is what I've learned about you over the past few months," Elias said. "Tax evasion, money laundering, sexual relationships with vulnerable clients, connections to organized crime figures. Any one of these issues would destroy what's left of your life. Together, they would put you in federal prison for the rest of your natural life." Brennan looked through the folder, his hands shaking. "How did you get this?" "I was a police detective for 15 years. I know how to investigate people who think they're smarter than they actually are." "What do you want?" Brennan asked again. "I want you to disappear, leave this state, change your name, start over somewhere else under a different identity. Never practice law again. Never contact anyone from your previous life. Never return to this area." "And if I refuse?" Elias gestured to the folder. Then this information gets distributed to every relevant law enforcement agency, along with evidence of your conspiracy with my ex-wife. You'll spend the next decade fighting federal charges, civil lawsuits, and probably some very angry people who don't appreciate being cheated. Brennan was quiet for several minutes, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. How long do I have? 1 week. Clean out your affairs, liquidate whatever assets you can, and disappear. If I see you in this area after next Friday, our agreement is void. Elias collected his recorder and folder, then stood to leave. At the door, he turned back. One more thing. If you ever try to contact my daughter, my ex-wife, or anyone else from this situation, I will find you. And next time, we won't just have a conversation. Brennan left town 4 days later. His house was sold to a cash buyer, his remaining assets liquidated through estate sale companies. He simply vanished, leaving behind only debts and bad memories. The State Bar Association closed his file, noting that the subject of their investigation was no longer practicing law and had left the jurisdiction. The FBI agents who'd been preparing to arrest him for financial crimes found only an empty house and a forwarding address that led nowhere. Thomas Brennan, as far as anyone could determine, had simply ceased to exist. Spring returned to the mountains. Elias and Lottie settled into their routine, now just the two of them in a house that felt exactly the right size. Lottie was accepted to the State University with a partial scholarship, planning to study criminal justice with a focus on sufferer advocacy. I want to help people who've been hurt by the system, she explained to Elias. People who need someone to fight for them when everyone else gives up. Elias was proud of his daughter, this young woman who'd learned hard lessons about justice and loyalty and the importance of protecting innocent people from hunters. On a warm evening in May, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Lottie was reading a book for her college preparation course, while Elias worked on his laptop, updating his client database and scheduling appointments for the following week. Dad? Lottie said. Yeah? Do you ever think about Mom? Elias considered the question. Sometimes. Do you miss her? I miss the person I thought she was. I don't miss the person she actually turned out to be. Lottie nodded thoughtfully. I used to feel guilty about not missing her more. But then I realized that missing someone who hurt us doesn't make sense. You don't need to feel guilty about protecting yourself. Is that what you did? Protected us? Elias looked at his daughter, this remarkable person who'd emerged from the wreckage of their family stronger and wiser than he dared to hope. Yes, he said. That's exactly what I did. That night, after Lottie had gone to bed, Elias sat in his shed and opened the notebook where he'd kept track of threats and consequences. Every name had been crossed out. Every problem had been solved. Every person who'd participated in the conspiracy against his family had faced appropriate consequences for their actions. He closed the notebook and locked it away with his other police equipment. It was finished now, this chapter of his life that had required him to become someone he'd hoped never to be again. But he wasn't sorry. Justice wasn't always clean or comfortable or legally sanctioned. Sometimes it required people to take matters into their own hands to ensure that actions had consequences, that hunters faced punishment, that innocent people were protected from those who would damage them. Elias had done what was necessary. His daughter was safe, his enemies were destroyed or scattered, and his life was his own again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with the sound of something ancient and patient, something that understood the difference between justice and revenge, between protection and cruelty, between necessary action and pointless violence. Elias locked his shed and walked back to the house, ready for whatever came next, knowing that he would face it with the same cold competence that had served him through the worst period of his life. In the morning, there would be furnaces to inspect, systems to repair, the familiar work that provided structure and purpose to his days. But tonight, there was only satisfaction in a job completed, a family protected, and enemies who would never threaten them again. The mountains held their secrets well, and Elias Carr had learned to be worthy of their silence. 6 months later, Mara returned to town. She appeared at Elias's workplace on a Tuesday afternoon, waiting in the parking lot beside his truck when he finished inspecting a school's heating system. She looked older, thinner, worn down by whatever life she'd built in her exile. Hello, Elias. Mara. Elias loaded his tools into the truck without hurrying. I thought you'd moved away permanently. I did, but I needed to come back to see Lottie. She's in college now, has her own life. I know. I've been following her social media accounts. She looks happy. Elias finished securing his equipment and turned to face his ex-wife. What do you want? I want to apologize for everything that happened, everything I did wrong. Apology noted. And I want to ask you something. Elias waited. What happened to Jensen, to Dr. Vance, to Brennan? I assume they moved on with their lives. Brennan disappeared completely. The police have no record of where he went. People disappear all the time, especially people with legal troubles. Mara stared at him, searching his face for some indication of guilt or satisfaction. She found nothing. You destroyed all of them, she said. Not just their careers or their reputations. You erased them completely. I protected my family from people who wanted to damage us. Is that what you call it? That's what it was. Mara was quiet for a moment, considering her next words carefully. Are you going to do the same thing to me? Elias looked at this woman who'd once been the center of his world, who'd shared his bed and raised his daughter and promised to love him until passing. Now she was just another problem to be managed, another potential threat to be neutralized. That depends entirely on your behavior, he said. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to see Lottie. Lottie is an adult. She can make her own decisions about who she wants in her life. Will you tell her I was here? If she asks, Mara nodded, accepting the conditional nature of his promise. Can I ask you one more thing? What? Do you ever regret it? What you became? Elias considered the question seriously. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret doing what needed to be done. What about forgiveness? What about mercy? I gave you mercy. You're still alive to ask these questions? Mara flinched at the implication, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is a letter for Lottie. If she wants to see me, she can call the number inside. If not, I'll respect her decision. Elias took the envelope without opening it. I'll give it to her. Thank you. Mara walked to her car, a 10-year-old sedan with rust spots and a cracked windshield, the kind of vehicle driven by someone who'd lost everything and was still losing. She drove away without looking back, and Elias never saw her again. That evening, he gave Lottie the letter. She read it while he cooked dinner, her expression changing from curiosity to sadness to something resembling pity. She wants to see me, Lottie said. That's your choice to make. What do you think I should do? Elias turned from the stove to look at his daughter, this young woman who'd grown up faster than anyone should have to, who'd learned hard lessons about trust and betrayal and the cost of loving people who weren't worthy of that love. I think you should do whatever will help you move forward with your life, he said. Don't make decisions based on guilt or obligation. Make them based on what's actually good for you. Lottie nodded and folded the letter carefully. I'll think about it. She never called the number. The letter went into a drawer in her room, forgotten among old school papers and childhood mementos. Mara became part of the past, a chapter that was closed and didn't need to be reopened. 2 years later, Lottie graduated from college with honors and a job offer from the state attorney general's office. She was engaged to a young lawyer who treated her with respect and kindness, who understood that she came from a family that had survived something difficult and emerged stronger. At her graduation party, held in the backyard of the house where she'd grown up, Lottie gave a speech thanking the people who'd supported her education and her dreams. Most of all, she said, I want to thank my father, who taught me that protecting the people you love sometimes requires difficult choices, and that justice isn't always pretty, but it's always necessary. The guests applauded, thinking they understood what she meant, not realizing they were witnessing the conclusion of a story that had begun years earlier with betrayal and ended with justice. Elias stood in the back of the crowd, watching his daughter begin her adult life surrounded by people who cared about her, protected by the choices he'd made when protection was required. After the guests left and the dishes were washed and the decorations put away, Elias and Lottie sat on the porch in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the mountain evening. Are you proud of me? Lottie asked. Every day. Even knowing what it cost? What you had to do? Elias looked at his daughter, this remarkable person who'd grown from the wreckage of their family into someone strong and decent and capable of making the world better. Especially knowing what it cost, he said. The mountains held their secrets, and the wind carried the scent of wood smoke from houses scattered through the valley. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, families gathered around dinner tables, Parents protecting their children from threats they would never fully understand. Elias Carr had built something worth protecting, and he'd protected it with the tools and skills and ruthless competence that had once made him a good police officer. The cost had been high, but the result was sitting beside him on this porch, planning a life dedicated to helping innocent people and fighting for justice. It was enough. It was everything. The end.